Hi, I'm Pam England from Birth Story Medicine. This is the first in a series of teaching tapes on the archetypes of the birth story process. So tonight's talk is called Who is Telling, Who is Listening? And I want to take you back to my very first awareness of the significance of asking this question, who is telling and who is listening? And this was years ago when I was in birth shock and trauma from my own cesarean, and I went to a cesarean support group. And at the cesarean support group, the leader told her trauma story, and all of the other women, there were about 4 of us, I think, told our stories in a fair amount of detail. And we experienced commiseration about how victimized we felt. We vilified the medical model, lots of tears. And when I left, I thought, oh, this is great. Somebody finally gets what I'm feeling. So I went to a second one, and it was at the second one I had an inkling that something was wrong here. The leader told her trauma story, and everybody listened passively and attentively to everyone else's trauma story, but there was no interaction. There was no process towards resolution. It was just, again, commiseration. And at the end of this, I remember driving home thinking, how is this going to help me stop feeling angry and confused? And I thought about it and decided not to go back. What I wanted was real healing, and I didn't think I would achieve it in this manner. So I began to study group dynamics, the communication that gets you through trauma, and then I learned about archetypes. And it was when I learned about archetypes, I began to think about the question of who is telling, who is listening. And within each of us, there's not just one voice, there's like a little village in us. And sometimes the person who is telling, the part of us that is telling the story is our child. Sometimes we tell the story from our little professor, statistically or with evidence about birth. And sometimes we tell it from our huntress, where we're really asking questions about what does this mean about me and how did I know to do that, and kind of introspective questions. So depending on where we are at the time of the telling, or who we're with, or how far along we are in our process, the part of us that is telling a story at any given time could be a different part. And even within one session, I've heard a storyteller begin in, let's say, her orphan voice, and suddenly go to her judge voice, and maybe towards the end be in her huntress voice. So even within one session, the parts of us that are telling the story or exploring the story can change. And it's very important for the teller to be heard by her listener, not just listening to the content, but listening to the parts of us that are telling the story, because our response to each of those parts should be different. So it's been my experience that when someone comes to tell me a birth story and they're in shock or emotional trauma still, that usually it's one of their child archetypes who begins the session, begins telling the story. And I won't go into it in detail in this recording, but the child archetype is really dynamic because there's not just one voice. The child archetype has many ways of being expressed. Sometimes it's the innocent child, or the magical, or sometimes it's the orphan child, or the part of the child that feels too little or doesn't think things are fair, which is like the victim child. And sometimes it's the judge child. That could also be a nature child. So depending on what's unfolding between a storyteller and her story listener, or how far a person's come in their process, the story will be told by one of those energies in the storyteller. Now, let's take a look. If we step back and we think about the story listener is also listening from the part of her that is one of her archetypes, or his. And if the listener is in their innocent or their magical child, and the teller is in their innocent or magical child, it's not very likely that much deep discussion or resolution will occur. They will feel understood by each other and share in their magical thinking about the birth, but it's unlikely that any deeper understanding will be achieved. Now, if you have, let's think about this combination. You have a person who's in their orphan child telling the story. An orphan just means that they feel that they were left out or left behind, that abandoned in birth, someone didn't show up for them, or someone showed up and they just couldn't receive help. We'll go more into this in another recording as well, but just get the gist of an orphan as someone who either feels left out, left behind, or doesn't even know how to receive someone when they do show up. Okay, so if that part is telling the story about how they were abandoned in birth, and the person who was listening was also abandoned in birth or feels abandoned in life, they will commiserate about being abandoned and people not showing up, and how awful it is when people don't show up for you. And again, there'll be commiseration, which feels sort of good in the moment, but there will be no resolution. And if someone is judging themselves for what happened in birth, for not knowing more, for not saying more, doing more, in some way blaming themselves for what happened, and the person who was listening is also either blaming the teller for not knowing more, doing more, saying more, then again, that storytelling session will go nowhere. The person who's telling the story will actually feel worse about not knowing enough, doing enough, whatever, but there won't be any healing. And if the person who is listening to the story is still judging themselves for what happened in their birth, or perhaps just in general in life, it's going to be hard for them to listen to someone who is judging themselves, because they won't know how to take them to another place, if that's the place that they're mostly in anyway. So you can see that the story listener and storyteller dynamic is really, really important. Now, the ideal situation here would be, we expect someone who is in shock and trauma to come in a child storyteller place. I didn't know enough. People didn't show up for me. I don't know what happened. I feel like I failed, and these kinds of expressions and feelings about the birth. That is to be expected. That's why they've come to tell the story, because they're not in a place where they can see their story differently or resolve it by themselves. Now, if this is the ideal situation, their story listener has already processed perhaps their own birth or a number of things in their lives, where they're very introspective, where they have processed some kind of shock and trauma in their own life and have a sense of what it feels like to be in that place, but also hope, and they see the potential of getting out of that place. They're trained in how to listen and how to guide, without cheerleading, without giving advice, but how to listen and how to guide the storyteller to look deeper and deeper and to find the resources within themselves to create a new narration. Now, this takes training. It's not likely that someone will just learn to do this naturally. I mean, it's possible, it's not likely. So when you have someone who is feeling lost and in self-blame and confused, and someone who's listening is not hooked by this and not in the same place as this, but they can hear it as one of the steps on the way to resolution, and they may be able to have a conversation with the storyteller that helps the storyteller think about their story from all kinds of different angles, and at the end of a storytelling session, have new insight about themselves, the situation, someone who was at the birth, whatever the situation is. So this is just a brief introduction to the importance of, if you are a storyteller and you want to tell your story because you're wanting to be heard or you're wanting some new insight, carefully choose your story listener so that it is someone who is not themselves wounded, in shock or trauma, angry, feeling victimized by the system. Because if you choose that person, they're not going to be able to truly hear you or help you find your way out because they haven't found their own way out. Now, if you want to commiserate, that would be a great story partner. But carefully choose a person who has the capacity not only to listen, but to help have a conversation that leads to deeper understanding. And just keep in mind that the more you tell your story to people who are wounded or angry or victimized or just self-judgmental as you're feeling, every time you tell a story to someone like that and you don't get a healing response, it's reinforcing the negative feelings in you. It's not resolving them. It's not making things better. So try to find someone who can be really helpful when you're telling your story. And if you're a story listener, you may not be completely resolved about what happened to you. But if you have had some kind of training or awareness about the story listening process and how to listen in a way that you're not listening to content, but you're listening to the deeper part of the story, and you also have hope and then expectation that there's a potential for this traumatic story to become something that informs this person in a positive way or brings them to more self-love or more self-compassion.